Hello and welcome. My name is Simon Timpley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network. Welcome to edition 106 of the Food Safety Fridays webinar program. We're delighted today to have George Howlett, CEO from Safe Food 360, and the subject is how to build a risk and compliance model for your food safety management system. Just a few housekeeping bits before we get started. Some of you are already using it, the chat bar in the sidebar. Please do type in there, tell us where you're from, where you're calling in from today, and say hello to us, say hello to each other. Do leave your questions till the end, or else they'll just scroll to Australia and we won't be able to find them. So just leave your questions till the end when we have the Q&A session. As I say each week, these webinars are sponsored by our kind sponsors, and one of those is Safe Food 360, Trace Analytics, Metla Toledo, AIB International, and DNVGL Business Assurance. These kind organisations support this programme and help to bring regular free education and free certificate of attendance and the slide deck, etc., and all for free. It is being recorded as well, so don't worry if you miss a little bit. The slides and the recording, the video recording, and the certificate of attendance will be distributed to all registrants afterwards. Okay, right. At this point, I'd like to introduce you to George Howlett from Safe Food 360. Hi, George. Welcome.
Hi, Simon. Thank you.
Nice to see you again. Good to have you back.
Yeah, good to be here again. Thank you.
Yeah, and where are you calling in from, George? Just for the
Dublin, as usual, in Ireland, from the home base of Safe Food.
Good. Okay. Right, George. If you want to get your slides ready, I'll just tell the audience about next week. We next week have got. In fact, there's no Food Safety Fridays. It's on Monday, actually. We've got a 4-hour training course, root cause identification and problem solving tools. So that's with Vladimir Sachinsky. It's a 4-hour online training on Monday, and join us and you'll pick up lots of tips and tools and templates to help you get to those root cause of those recurring problems and help improve your food safety quality management system. So hopefully some of you will sign up for that. George, can you get your slides? Are they available?
Yeah.
If you put them on. Right, great. I'll be back for the Q&A later, but for now I'll hand you over to George.
Okay, thanks, Simon. Hello, everybody, and welcome. The topic of today's webinar is how to build a risk and compliance model for your food safety management system. The title is slightly general. I will explain it now further, just to focus our attention a little bit more. But before we do that, I want to point out that we do have on our website some free resources which kind of relate to today's discussion. So we have some Excel templates on risk assessment models, which I'll be discussing during the presentation. So please do feel free just to log on there and download them. They are 100% free, and some of them you may well indeed find of use to you. Okay, so what we're going to discuss today is the area of risk and compliance models for your food safety management system. And the reason we want to discuss this is I suppose, in the light of the recent publication of the ISO 22000 standard, which was published, I believe, back in maybe January of this year. Nothing new about a new version of a food safety standard, but this one in particular has been a long time coming, and it did kind of bring to light some interesting changes in terms of how food safety management standards can look. And what we're seeing, I think, in general, is more and more a trend towards developing food safety systems which are genuinely based on kind of risk throughout, from top level right down to even the smallest activity and task that you may be conducting in your food business operation. And In this, we're also seeing a kind of a greater alignment with the approach that we take for identifying risks and improvements, opportunities for improvement, alignment with kind of risk models in general, which are used in businesses. So they may be used for general business risks, financial risks, risks in the marketplace, the goodwill of the company. And the ISO in particular appear to be driving the food safety standards model down that road. Now, of course, they do that for various reasons. The rest of the ISO series of standards in this area, management standards, quality standards, it's obviously in their interests that they align the standards as much as possible. But we have seen this more recent revision of the ISO 22K, a very clear, conscious and direct shift towards taking a risk-based approach, not just in the business, but also when it comes to food safety management. Now, in doing that, so what we're going to do is we're going to center the discussion around that, because while the other standards, say in the GFSI, haven't been quite as obvious in that move, there is a tendency, even in those standards, more and more to shift towards more traditional models. And the model which the ISO 20 in general are citing now is this, what we call plan, do, check, act cycle. And we're going to take a look at that. What is that, and how does that relate to food safety management? You might ask that question. And certainly those of you guys who are operating under the FSSC 22K, for example, this will become of importance in the immediate future as they update their standards to align with the new version of ISO 22K. Excuse me. So the model and the approach, really, so this is all about how do you approach things when it comes to food safety. And the ISO are very, very clear now that they would like this approach taken, this approach of planning, doing, checking, and then acting on the various elements of your food safety system. Now, this really, when you boil it down and when you analyze it more closely, in fact represents a very logical approach. In fact, it's the approach that food businesses take, whether they're conscious of it or not, in putting in place their food safety management systems. And the standard appears to be just asserting that approach and clarifying it clearly for users of the standard. So just to take a closer look at what these four elements mean. So the planning stage really is about establishing the general objectives of what you want to do with your food safety system. So what's the objective for your processes? What resources do we need? And what do we expect to get out of the system? What's the desired outputs? And then obviously looking at maybe associated risks involved in doing that and the opportunities for improving the overall management system as well. So that's the planning stage, which most companies will go through at some point in time. Next up is the doing. So that's taking the planning and putting it into place, so implementing the system as defined in the initial planning stage. Logically, then we move on to checking. So once the system is up and running, so you've put in your HACCP system, for example, you've put in your PRPs, operational prerequisite programs. They're now in place. You're doing them, making those checks and record, and then you want to actually record that result and record that data. And this is the checking, or what we typically might call the monitoring stage. So we're measuring, we're looking, we're checking. We're verifying essentially that what we've planned to do, our objectives, are in fact being realized in some shape or form. So the products that we produce, the services that we deliver, we'll analyze this data and then we'll make some conclusions around whether or not the objectives of the food safety system are being met. Now, an example of this could be as simple as having a critical control point in your process. You want to achieve a certain temperature or time, and the monitoring activity will provide the data for you to determine whether that is in fact the case or not. But it can also be on a very high level. You may have some higher level objectives that you want to maintain product failures in the market, i.e. recalls, at a certain level or minimum level, obviously. And that could be a higher level objective that you might have as well. Now, the final stage in this approach, which they call ACT, is really about analyzing the data in depth to see, are there areas where performance can be improved or things can be improved on what would be a continual basis. So this is not a new concept. Continuous improvement has been around as long as there have been management systems. But again, we see more and more a drive of the standards, and the ISO is no exception, towards genuinely instilling a culture of improvement, seeking out improvements to better the system, obviously, but also the outputs and the results for consumers, customers, and other stakeholders in the business as well. So the point of this is that the ISO 22K standard sees this happening at two levels in your business. So at an organizational level, so that's the higher level processes, and then also drilling down onto the front line, the processes, the shop floor, the products that are being made, and the activities surrounding those operational, the operations of your company. So it's at two levels that they see this approach being taken. So the ISO have constructed in the standard this kind of model just to explain in more detail what they expect to see. So this is an illustration which they've produced in the standard. I've just extracted it verbatim. I haven't changed it. So they have a planning stage where you define the context of your organization. So what is it that you do? So what is your business about? Obviously producing product to supply a market. But it may also be to service the needs of consumers, consumer trends, the expectations of shareholders or owners in the business, or any other stakeholders. So you may be operating in certain objective market conditions as well, and you want to define that context. Leadership now also plays a huge part of the standard. So the ISO, of course, recognize that things typically are led from the top down, and defining the attributes, the qualities of the leadership are important. Planning, figuring out what you want to do in advance of implementing it. And then, of course, supports that are needed, like resources. The do section then for food safety is in relation to operations, and there is a more detailed breakdown of what that looks like, and we'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. Checking, so evaluating how you're getting on in terms of performance, acting then by improving the system where opportunities can be identified. So it is quite logical. It does make sense once it's explained clearly, and can have a lot of value, I think, for food businesses to understand that process. So focusing now on the operations stage, which we looked at, just to go back to the previous slides to show you where we're coming from. So we are at the do phase, which relates to operations, putting into practice practically what it is you want to achieve. So for operations, when it comes to food safety, you can see the model there, guys. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but just to explain on the bigger picture, we have the plan phase where we look at our prerequisite programs, the systems of traceability and emergency issues. And the key point here is hazard analysis. So the new version of ISO 22K does go into quite a lot of detail around hazard analysis. It defines in better detail, in fact, what a hazard is, what a risk is, what's desirable outputs from that. So you conduct a hazard analysis, try to identify hazards that may occur, that may cause problems or issues, put in place control measures, obviously, where they're justified and where relevant. And then you construct your hazard control plan, which we traditionally have called the HACCP plan. and also the operational prerequisite programs. Finally, then there's a verification plan just to double check that the logic, the science behind the whole plan is real. In other words, your control plan is in fact capable of meeting the requirements. It is in fact capable of producing safe and legal food products. So from there, then we can go to the do phase, the implementation of your plan, getting it in place, control and monitoring and measuring systems, your CCPs, your operational prerequisites. And then obviously where the system detects a failure or a deviation beyond what's desirable, then how you manage those non-conformities in your system. The second phase then is the verification activities. That's in fact your recording, measuring, recording, and reviewing the analysis, the data that comes from those. And then the act phase then is really pulling that data together in some kind of digestible form to drive improvement. So that will come from things such as audits, outputs from audits that will feed into management review systems. And then that will go back into the redesign and the replanning of your system as time goes by. Okay. So again, I think most of us will be quite familiar with this approach, but it is good, and I think it is valuable for the ISO to spell it out and show clearly what they expect in certification to that standard. Another thing they're introducing, well, I won't say introducing, but they're certainly underpinning more and more, is what they now term as the risk-based thinking. So this is a fundamental of food safety management, is that your system is underpinned by a scientific approach to analyzing risks. And then that makes a huge amount of sense, because as requirements become more difficult and more burdensome, limited resources really, it does dictate that you need to do risk assessment and do it at the best level you can. Good quality risk assessment is always of value. So again, they've said that this needs to take place at two levels. You need to do it at an organizational level, so review it in the context of your business in general, but then also at an operational level, and that really is talking about your HACCP plan. So doing your hazard analysis, your risk assessment, and identifying what specific control measures may be required in the process. Risk-based thinking is very important because it does have an impact on any business who seeks certification to the FSSC and other GFSI standards, because the BRC, for example, if you are to take the time to read through it and count the number of times it requests something to be done around risk, it'll be almost in excess of 100 mentions of that. So in other words, for the BRC standard, you will need to do some sort of implied risk assessment. That can be a formal or informal assessment of risk. But the point is that these standards are, with each version, with each evolution, demanding more around having a risk-based approach to what you do. Now that can be good, it can be bad. It can be good on the level that you have a more scientifically based system that makes sense. But it does also lead to a lot more work. Conducting risk assessment is resource intensive. It does require skills, requires time, it requires data, and it requires somebody who can pull all that together and express it in some sort of output that you can take action on. We'll talk a little bit more about how this risk-based thinking is applied in practice in a moment. So taking what the ISO are talking about at a high level, that's that approach of planning, doing, checking and acting. It could be distilled down into a slightly simpler form, which is on the screen there. So this is an example of how risk-based thinking or an approach can be adopted. So you have these external issues that come from outside the business, and they can be business-related issues, or they can be food safety-related issues. So, for example, changes in legislation, emerging hazards, for example, or outbreaks, which are recalls, which are taking place globally. They may all feed into external issues to do with risk. Internal issues then could be to do with your own business activities. So perhaps maybe resources could be an issue, or you're looking at new product development, new products coming into your operation. A very intensive and high turnover MPD project internally, for example, could also maybe contribute to risks and indeed opportunities too. Interested parties, so that could be anything from governments, regulatory agencies, to your customers, or to other stakeholders in the community or elsewhere. And they will ultimately find expression in requirements. Those requirements can be anything from, indeed the requirements of a GFSI standard. They could be specifications for products that you want to produce, but ultimately those requirements are defined, they're documented, and they become the basis around which you conduct your activities. So once you have those three kind of inputs pretty much identified, you're in a position then to identify the risks and opportunities to the business. And then that feeds into that cyclical approach of planning what you're doing, put it in place, doing some evaluation and review and improvement. Okay, so it's a slightly simpler model, guys, and should help to clarify the approach that the standards more and more are pushing us towards. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at how, practically speaking, you can actually address these requirements. Just to make a note that while all this looks very good when you read the standard, and while it makes a lot of sense, most rational people will say, yes, this looks good. This makes sense to us. Certainly, we would like to have this approach in our organization. It does bring with it some real practical challenges, because it's like everything else, guys. You get a line written in a standard, it makes sense, and then when you go to look at to implement it, you realize that okay, this takes time, it takes resources. How do I approach it? How do we actually realize these requirements? And what you end up essentially is a lot more work to meet the requirements of the standards. But that may all be well and good. Companies like to improve. Companies like to do their best. But one of the major issues that companies face is, for example, on the planning phase, assessing risks, how do I, in fact, conduct a risk assessment for a food safety system? So the next few slides will kind of just help you out on that. And you can refer to our models. We've the Excel models up on the resource page, so you can download these afterwards, and you can actually use those models there. So planning. So what we're talking about here, guys, is actions to address risk and opportunities. So at a very high level, what the ISO standard is saying and other standards is that actions within your food safety system should be put in place and designed to achieve two things. One is compliance, a level of compliance. And the second thing is to address identified risks. So on the screen, you can see that some of your actions will increase compliance once you put them in place, get you closer to your standards and your objectives. And within those actions, there will also be very specific tasks, jobs, and inspections you do that have a risk associated with them. So this is risky. This action is more important because if there's a failure, the potential outcome is significant in some way. It will be undesirable in some way, and that could be relating to your business, or it could be relating to the health of your consumer who purchases the products that you produce. Now, these actions or tasks, just to go back to the previous slide, that can be anything from your CCP monitoring, operational prerequisites, general PRPs, your audits, corrective actions, supplier controls. They can be virtually anything in your organization that is designed to address compliance needs or to reduce the risk of your activities in some fashion. Okay. And actions typically will have either one or both of those characteristics. They'll either have a compliance nature around them, and they may well indeed have a compliance and a risk attribute as well. Okay, so that during the planning phase, you need to kind of determine that. separating the wood from the trees and identifying the nature of those actions and their importance. But in all cases, your actions will need to have a few attributes, and one of them is that you need to define what exactly the action is. So what will be done, when will it be conducted, who will do it, and what exactly is the output, the expected output. So for example, if you're designing your auditing programs, you will have to audit the requirements of your GFSI standard, of course, but not all elements of that audit program will be that important. So you might need to just, spell it out, the times, the schedules, the resources that are needed to effectively implement that. Ideally, all the actions should be measurable in some shape or form. It won't always be the case, but usually it should be. So you should be able to get some sort of quantifiable measure from this particular action in your system. You need to determine whether or not the action is compliance and or risk-based. That's important. And the action should be reportable. So the data given off, ideally, should find its way into a system or an approach that can throw out some good quality analysis. So you don't spend all your time sifting through mountains of data to try and figure out what in fact is going on. And the actions themselves should trigger improvements. So the data coming off them should tell you whether or not an improvement is possible. Is there an opportunity there? So these actions are important. They together represent the entirety of your food safety management system. So it's well worth your while putting some time into them, thought about around how to get the best out of each individual action in the food safety system. Now, in the planning phase that we talked about, really when you, when you just distill it down to its essence, what it's saying is that you need to, when you're putting actions in place, conduct some sort of assessment of risk. So you'll identify hazards and potential issues that can go wrong. You will mitigate those via certain actions or control measures. There's a variety of names that you can use. And that requires you to develop risk assessment models. So you do have the option to look at it and go, in general, yes, that's risky, it's not. That's fine. That can work in a lot of cases. But less so these days as the auditors become more demanding. So you may need to develop a variety of risk assessment models to genuinely make your system risk-based. And the difficulty is that one model, which you may use for HACCP, may not work that well for supplier assessment or for determining the risk of audit programs. So you may need a whole variety of different risk assessment models, which are simple, usable, but get to the heart of what the risk is for the particular activity. So we're just going to briefly run through some of these models and what they may look like. So your HACCP model is pretty straightforward. Most companies operate a very simple matrix model. So that's your traditional probability by severity model, and that gives you some sort of risk calculation, qualitative, quantitative, seldom is a quantitative, but usually qualitative in output. And you can see there, guys, on the screen, that simple kind of risk assessment matrix. And I think that works well for most companies. I don't envisage that changing. Some companies do, add in a third element, which is detectability. I've seen models like that. But in this case, for your hazard analysis, your HACCP study, this type of approach is more than adequate, I would suggest. Okay, so that's not such a major issue, and it's underpinned by the codex. They do suggest you take this kind of approach. However, when it comes to other parts of your system, like your prerequisite programs, for example, and all the GFSI standards more or less now say you must risk assess these, kind of supporting programs, the prerequisites and the operational prerequisites. The traditional matrix model kind of breaks down. So the HACCP model is ideal when it comes to a specific hazard, looking at a specific process step. So salmonella, the risk of salmonella surviving a cooking process, it works really well in that particular scenario. But when it comes to assessing something like, for example, an audit program, that matrix model breaks down into slight bits, and you need to redefine the model slightly. It kind of takes on a character which is more akin to the FMEA approach. That's the failure effect mode analysis, which for you guys who are working in other industries will be more familiar with. So really what you're asking here, what's the likelihood of the activity being audited failing in some way? So you can see the probability end of it, the likelihood of occurrence. We will say for number 3, the failure of the activity being audited is likely to happen often and frequently. So in other words, if I'm auditing a CCP, for example, you might determine that CCP does go out of control quite often. You might also have a rating for 1, which is the failure of the activity being audited is unlikely to happen. It's rare and remote. So you can see the difference, guys. You're kind of tailoring the description of your risk ratings to be more focused around the activity itself. The severity of impacts are similar. So number 3, failure of the activity being audited is likely to lead to an immediate grave health impact, recall, or regulatory issue. Now you can rephrase that in whatever way you want. You could also add in there could lead to an adverse impact on the goodwill of the business in the marketplace, for example. So it's really up to yourself, but this is just designed to give you a good overview or a good example of how you might define for business processes, management processes, or prerequisites, how the model can be adjusted slightly. When you multiply probability by severity, you will get a rating that can be high, medium, or low. And again, guys, it's good practice in these to take the risk-based approach the ISO talks about to define what should happen if you achieve that risk. So you may, for example, decide to audit a high-risk activity at a frequent level, minimum of every 3 months, for example. A medium one, you could do every 6 months, and a low risk every 12 months, for example. So that's good practical use of your time in terms of doing risk assessment. And it provides a very clear logic of the planning of your activities and your actions, which you can show to an auditor, and very few auditors would disagree with this approach. It makes sense. So that's the example on the auditing front. Let's just take a prerequisite here, which is calibration. So again, it's quite similar, guys. The probability at 3, which would be high, is failure of the calibration status is likely to happen often and frequently. So what you're saying here is that it comes to risk assessing a particular device in your business. You could say, well, look, this is quite a sensitive device, and the likelihood of it going out of calibration is high, or low, or medium. Okay, so that's nicely tailored specifically for your calibration plan. Okay, the severity of impact is again the same. So let's look at the rating 3, which is high. Failure of the calibration status of the device is likely to lead to an immediate grave health impact, a recall, or regulatory issue. So what we're saying here is that if the device does go out of calibration, let's say it's a thermocouple measuring the core temperature of a cooking process, in that case, you may decide that the severity of impact could be high. So your outputs here could be that you want to calibrate this device at a more frequent level, i.e. you want to check the calibration status daily or monthly, or as we go down the risk, maybe a simple external annual certified calibration would be more than adequate. But again, guys, what I'm showing you here is a very simple but practical approach to meeting the quite lofty aspirations of the ISO 22K standard for developing a truly risk-based food safety management system. So this makes light work of it, really, for you. It gives you a model to work on, so you're not scratching your head trying to figure out how to implement those requirements. The next model we're looking at, guys, is supplier risk assessment. So again, the rules of the game change completely when it comes to now looking at suppliers who deliver product to you. That matrix model, again, really doesn't work because it's fantastic for a specific hazard on a specific point. But when you try to apply to a supplier, who's maybe supplying you with many different ingredients, all with different hazards, then that becomes completely unworkable. It breaks down as a model and it doesn't work. So you may choose to develop what are called criteria-based models, where you list out the various things that that contribute to risk of a supplier. So, for example, do they have a GFSI certification? If the answer was yes, you may determine them to be lower risk. If the answer is no, you may be determine them as higher risk, and you can put a value around that, some sort of rating figure or weighted figure. Do they supply certificates of analysis? Do they produce allergens on site? Does the supplier come from a country which is considered to be a high-risk country? Have they had any recalls in the last 2 years? And so on. Just get rid of that. So listing all that relevant criteria out and assigning some weighted values to them, because not every criteria will be as important as the next, so you may want to weight them. That can then produce for you a total risk value, which could be measured as, again, medium, high, medium, or low, or level 1, level 2, level 3. So the overarching point about this, guys, is that to truly address the trend towards a risk-based thinking model for food safety management does really, by definition, require you to put some effort and time into developing the appropriate risk assessment models. And that's what those slides have essentially covered there. Okay. So I hope that's of use and that's of help. And those models are on the Excel workbook, which you can download from the resources page on Safety 360's website. Next up then is the do side of it, and that's the operational side. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on this, but let's assume you've implemented all your systems based on risk. The frequencies of your activities will change. The level of analysis might be different and so on. What you now need to do is just make sure that that system is implemented, that you are in fact doing what you have stated that you will do in the planning phase. So really the key point there is that you need to make sure that the actions happen. And some sort of very basic system can be useful there just to track that activities that are due for completion are in fact completed. That's key. You can do all the planning you want, you can put all the systems in place that you wish, but if they're not being conducted and you're not aware of the fact, then your system becomes meaningless. And at the very best, holes start to appear in the system where risk increases. Okay, so you may want to just keep an eye on your actions by volume, making sure that you're hitting the targets. If actions are open and they do go overdue, you want to really know what the age of those, how important are they? So again, higher risk actions which remain incomplete should be prioritized over lower risk actions. So a simple register of actions might help in that case. So checking, so this is the third element of that 4-stage approach, is to check our performance evaluation. So you've done your actions, you've done your tests, you've done your monitoring, and data has been given off in some shape or form. So ideally, to really, practically speaking, implement this type of approach, I mean, unless you're unusual and you're a food business that doesn't generate an avalanche of data from its monitoring activities, and I don't believe there's many of those businesses out there these days, you will get a lot of data which will almost overwhelm the company day to day. So usually what will happen is the data will be gathered, someone will take a look at it day by day, check by check, file it away, and seldom will it see the light of day until perhaps an auditor comes in and asks you for it, or a customer may ask you for it. But that's fine, guys. That's getting the job done, and it's addressing the basic requirements. But locked into that data, or locked up in that data, is a wealth of value, which, if you can extract it, can be quite meaningful. So, depending on how you can manage, collate, and get this data together, you can, once your system is genuinely risk-based, based on risk assessment, you can start actually rating that risk level day to day. So that may require you collating the data a little bit, popping it into some well-designed Excel workbooks, and producing an overall rating figure or compliance figure. So that's the analysis of your results stage. So that's the ISO says you should do that. You should analyze the data coming off. You should see what trends are happening, where are the issues, where do they come from, and that feeds into obviously you taking some improvement action later on. On the screen is a good example of how you can analyze this data using statistical process control. So for you guys out there who are SQF certified, the recent version of that standard now makes a requirement that you statistically analyze monitoring data. So again, that's just literally a line that's been inserted in the standard. However, it does present massive challenges for most companies, because to do statistical analysis on data, again, requires you to bring that data together. You need to know a little bit about SPC, about how to measure standard deviations, capabilities. So, but the kind of things that you may want to look at is things such as CP and CPK values, particularly around CCPs. So, how capable is my critical control point, the process underlining is, capable of meeting the critical limits? So you may well be getting the results 90% within limits, but then there might be, because the system isn't fully capable, you may be getting 10% of your results drifting out. Now, unless you're doing 100% inspection, that is an issue. So SPC, statistical process control, measuring variation, the distribution of your results, and control charts can all be quite useful. And certainly, as I say, if you're SQF certified, this will become a real issue for you. And under the ISO 22K, there is an implied suggestion that you should be doing this type of analysis on the data of your actions and your monitoring that you're conducting. Okay, so SPC can be done again in Excel. There are specific products in the market which can be used. Really depends on what level you want to do it to, and the importance of it in the context of your objectives. Okay, so the final stage then is ACT, and ACT is all about improvements, and improvement is really all about in-depth analysis of your data to produce trends, separate out information into categories, and giving yourself the chance of identifying an area where you can make improvements. So just, this is not as easy as it looks. Most small to medium-sized food businesses probably wouldn't get to this level of analysis really. So larger companies, yes, they can do it. They typically will have the resources. If it's the policy to do this, then it does exist. So these changes in standards really are going to impact on smaller food businesses, medium-sized businesses of lesser scale, because collecting data in a large food company is pretty much the same as doing it in a small food company, but you may not have the time and resources to do that. So again, you really kind of want to be smart and be selective about what you analyze. So things such as auditing. Auditing is a great activity because it's really focused on throwing up non-conformances. So you may want to do some high-level analysis on audits non-conformances, determine which non-conformances were critical, which were major, where are they coming from as well. So you can probably produce some nice Pareto graphs like on the screen there, for example. And that could just immediately tell you, look, we need to be looking in this area to get improvements. Let's forget about the majority of the stuff going on. But we can see that this particular line or this particular process is contributing the vast majority of our non-conformances from internal audits, for example. Okay, so it's that type of analysis which really helps you comply with the ACT element of the total food safety management system. Another area where companies can typically apply the resources most effectively is in the area of corrective actions. So corrective action represents something that has already gone wrong. It's been identified already. So we all hate corrective actions. It's like getting when somebody approaches you with a corrective action, they're essentially saying, I'm coming to you and giving you some work. So nobody likes that, but if you can change your focus, you can see, well, look, this is actually quite valuable. If you can pull together all the corrective actions over time and start to analyze them in different ways by volume, for example, total number of actions open over a given period of time, the nature of those corrective actions. So how many of them were significant in terms of risk? Maybe we should look at those. What was the root cause of the corrective action? If you're doing root cause analysis, hugely valuable in terms of its potential to allow you to focus your energy on improvement. Corrective actions by source, for example. So, it's not a blame game. It's about identifying, perhaps which departments, which processes, which sites, if you're a large global operator, are contributing the most in terms of corrective action work that needs to be conducted. So again, the challenge here for food businesses is how do we organize ourselves in such a way that this becomes a seamless automatic or semi-automatic process where you have companies having to manually collate data, organize it, present and report on it, distribute that and review it. That is significant. It's significant in terms of the use of skilled and expensive resources within your company. So you need to obviously approach this at the planning stage with the objectives to say, how do we do this? But how do we do this without having to invest huge sums of money, dragging resources away from core activities, value-adding activities, to get the data presented in the way that we need. Okay, so just to summarize then, guys, we are witnessing more and more a trend in the global food safety standards, which is telling us that we need to adopt an approach which is very much focused on risk, underpinning your system with risk. And by definition, that means you need to adopt good quality risk models, and you need to be able to extract the data from your system in such a way that allows you to get to work on improvement without too much distraction from the day-to-day operations. Okay, so Simon, that's me finished. I'm happy to take any questions at this stage. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Thanks very much, George. If you want to switch your webcam on, stop your slides, and then we'll do the Q&A. We've got a good 10 minutes to take some questions. So, wow. Robin, let's start with this one. Can you see that, George? Robin Wallace, when my site was initially certified to ISO 22000, we had a difficult time with the term OPRP since it is not included in the traditional US HACCP training. To help, we looked at OPRPs as analogous to CPs. Is this reasonable?
There is a slight difference. In fact, I think the new version of the standard has a clear definition of what an OPRP is compared to CCP. And I'm vaguely aware that the FSSC 22000 standard, when it's next revised, will have a very, very clear definition and indeed probably a workflow decision tree to allow you to identify the difference between the two. Okay. We actually have on the resource page on Safe Food a white paper, which has a decision tree which would facilitate you determining whether it's a CCP, PRP, or an OPRP. So if they'd like to go onto that and just download that white paper, that gives some very clear guidance. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, George. This one's a rather long question. I will have to read it because people won't see this in the video version. Amit, having risk-based food safety systems is definitely an economic and effective way of controlling hazards. Even more, I agree with the view. Incorporating opportunities into the model does make great sense. What's worrying, however, is having different models for various system elements, e.g. calibration, supplier, etc. how easy would it be to integrate these risk factors in order to get an overall system risk score? Wouldn't it be like comparing apples to oranges in the metaphorical way?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Yes and no. So while the model that you use to identify the risk level may be different, and arguably should be different, the ultimate expression of that risk can be aligned. So albeit you might take one road to determine if it's high, medium, or low. You can also, each different model can have the same output in terms of expression of risk, and therefore you can kind of make them equal in an overall context. So yeah. It is possible. We actually will be producing a small little technical data sheet on how that can be done in the next period of time. But the question is good. It's trying to understand how you find a common denominator by using different models, and that is a valid question. But there are means and ways of doing it. Slightly complex, but it can be done. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, George. Next one, Gyro. Great lecture. Thank you so much. Could you please expand a little bit more about compliance management? This is such a new and huge issue.
Yes. Okay. So traditionally, the food safety standards have focused around more so around risks and controlling food safety hazards. Over time, there has been kind of a shift, kind of a balancing of risk with compliance. So compliance is a very simple concept. Are we doing what we say we are doing? So if you have to do 100 tasks in the week to be compliant against the BRC standard or the local legislation, it's a simple question: have you done that? So if you've done 95 of your 100 tasks, you're 95% compliant at that moment in time. It has no regard to the nature of the actions, whether they contribute or to risk, or whether they eliminate risk. It's just simply an action, and it's either done or it's not done. And based on that, you're either compliant or not compliant. Risk is slightly different. Risk is an action in the same way that may well have a compliance nature, but there's a specific character about that action which contributes to the mitigation of risk. And so that's, in a very simple sense, that's what compliance is about. The emergence of compliance as a more important, being more important, comes from the fact that there's been food safety issues, what generally is described as food safety issues, things such as Horsegate, the efficacy of food products, which, while they're not food safety concerns per se, they do mislead consumers, and there is fraud issues, and therefore compliance is just kind of feeding into that. Yeah.
Okay, rightio. Esperanza, do the preventive controls usually coincide with CCP?
They can. So CCP is a preventative control measure. It's designed to control a critical aspect of your process. You can say it in a very simple way, is that CCP is something in the operation process which you are almost pretty certain, if it goes wrong, is going to lead to problems in the marketplace and consumer health. You can have other preventative controls which are not critical in nature, so if they do fail, they may not necessarily actually contribute to issues of food safety or legal compliance at that moment in time. Now, over time, if it continues, it may well do that, accumulate to the point where it gives issues. So CCP is an example of a preventative measure, but it's not by all means the only one.
Okay, thanks. And Mohammed, can you give an example of an internal and external issues and interested parties?
Okay. Yeah. So an internal issue can be, say, one of a lack of investment in the capital, processing equipment. It's getting old. You may not have enough resources. You may have not designed your food products correctly to be safe. It could be human resource issues, industrial relations issues. It could be anything that centers around the actual business itself producing the food product. External issues is the world within which the business operates, its markets, the political environment, social, economic environments. So the objective factors surrounding the business. And your stakeholders are your interested parties, stakeholders, shareholders, governments, local governments, your consumers, individuals and groups of individuals who play a part in your business in some shape or form. And that could be a willing participation, or it could be an unwilling participation as well.
Okay. Sarah, just a question about Safe Food 360 software. Obviously, a lot of those screenshots within you came directly from the software, I think. So she's asking, is the software available in other languages, Polish, Spanish, Russian, Brazilian, Portuguese?
Yes, all of the above, with the exception of Polish at the moment, but that we will have a Polish version quite soon.
Okay, thanks. Robin, another long one. In the US, we are required to meet the FSMS requirements for preventive controls.
Yes.
We have combined our HACCP plan for ISO 22000 certification and our food safety / preventive controls plan for the FDA. We have not yet been audited by the FDA, but have you seen this combined plan work in your experience?
No is the short answer. I'm not saying what they've done is wrong or incorrect. Actually, it makes complete sense. I'm not aware of an audit where a company has done that. So to date, what I've seen to date is that companies who are complying with FSMS have just simply developed a preventive controls plan and addressed those requirements. And then I think by implication, they've assumed that it will meet the requirements of HACCP. And I think, I mean, it's still early days and it's still actually an open question, but I suspect that the certification bodies will, let's say SQF and others, will accept the preventive controls plan as a de facto HACCP plan, in the future. But it is at the moment very, very open, and I've no specific example that I could draw upon to answer that question. Yeah.
Okay. Bit of a left field question.
Okay.
Manfred, how do we control allergens in workplace vending machines?
Oh, okay.
Can you remember back to when you was a food safety manager all them years ago, George?
Yeah. Barely. I would just post that up on the IFSCM forum in the appropriate place, and maybe some smarter people might be able to answer that.
That's a good idea. I'll put the link in the sidebar so you can go and ask your question on there, Manfred. It's a good question. I'm sure you'll get lots of comments from the users on the forum. Harry, does Safe Food 360 implement systems with tailor-made solutions?
Do we implement systems with tailor-made solutions? I'm not really sure what that question is about.
The Safe Food 360 software, obviously it's a system, but then for each individual company, they must need to make it fit with their business.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, so the system in general provides standard workflows which meet the requirements of the GFSI and other standards. Within that, they can be configured to meet the local business needs, depending on the market they're operating in, the customers they're servicing, and so it's configurable within that. So,
yeah, and Javier is just saying Safe Food 360 is great. So nice bit of feedback. We're not making it an advertisement or anything. We're not doing that, but it's just for the comments that are coming through. So, and the questions. Right, Don, we have combined HACCP and PC plan and FDA and had no issue. That's just a comment from Don.
Very good.
Right. Well, that's bang on 4 p.m. here in the UK. It's on the hour. So I Any more questions? Let's see, James, we just completed an SQF audit and the auditor did accept our approach of combining HACCP and HARP-C plans. Okay, that's good.
Brilliant. Good. Yeah.
Right, yeah, thanks for the presentation, George. We'll send the video recording the slides afterwards, which will, people can watch again. But we'll also put in the follow-up email the link to the downloadable resources that you've mentioned as well. And if anybody has a question that pops in the head later, we can always fire it over to you, George, then, if that's okay.
Right. Yep.
Right, that was George Howlett from Safe Food 360. We'll follow up with the links to the resources that George mentioned, the slides, the recording, and I will now just pop the certificate in the sidebar for you so you can download that. Should be able to see it in the sidebar. Click the download now button. That'll take you to Dropbox. You print and sign it, or you open it in an image editing software and type your name, and that's it. Okay, we've got the training on Monday with Vladimir Sachinsky, root cause analysis. So yeah, hope to see some of you there. Have a nice weekend, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Bye.